Hey there! Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 285, and I'm calling it, What's Up with Autoimmune Diseases? My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. By the way, if you want to reach me for any reason, questions, comments, etc., I now have a Google Voice number that you can text me on. My number is 978-712-9556. I have a memoir coming out in a few weeks, so if you'd like a free PDF version or Kindle version, just leave a text with your first name and email address, and I will send it over to you. You can always email me on my contact page as well, and that's on my website, healingoutsidethebox.com, and there'll be a link in the show notes. So you can email me on the website, same thing with your first name and email address if you'd like a copy of the memoir or an updated new podcast episode when it goes out. Now, as a side note, I got a question recently that I thought I'd spend a minute talking about. The question was, is it really worth it to grow my own herbs? My initial thought was, well, it depends. You don't have to be a foodie from Brooklyn to appreciate how much better fresh herbs will make a dish taste and smell. But which herbs to grow or not grow may depend on how much money you want to spend versus how much time you have versus whether or not you consider growing food to be fun or frustrating and how much space you have either in your backyard or windowsill. The first thing to ask yourself is, what am I cooking? Like most people, I guess, I tend to categorize recipes into ethnic groups. I cook mostly Italian and Asian, so there are certain fresh herbs that are definitely worth the time and will save me money. And I'm talking now in April, May, so it's the time of year to start thinking about taking the herbs outside as well. Like flowering plants, you can separate them into annuals, which grow only for one season. And there's a few that are much better fresh and worth it. These are basil and parsley. They grow fast and do well outside as well as inside. I usually have a basil plant on my windowsill and just pick off leaves when I'm making something Italian. If you pick off the leaves at the top before it flowers, it will keep growing leaves. Now, parsley grows easily as well and can be used for most Mediterranean dishes and a lot of other dishes. If you want to spend a few bucks, you could also buy seed starter kits on Amazon or even grow lights if you want to start handing out basil plants to your friends and family. Or if you've got kids in grade school, this could be a nice and hopefully fun project to do with them. Exposing young people to growing food will pique their interest in knowing where their food comes from. In my opinion, that's about as important a lesson as anything they'll learn in school. Now, there are also perennial herbs that will come up every year, especially if you don't have winters that are too harsh. The popular ones are oregano, thyme, and rosemary. I've got oregano and thyme growing on my windowsill, and I'll probably put them outdoors in about another month. But they do great indoors as well. Two plants that will come up every year in greater quantities are scallions and chives. I love growing scallions, and I'll put them in just about anything. If you want to start the scallions indoors, just buy a bunch of organic scallions at the supermarket or farmer's market. They're opening up soon. Then cut off the root end before you start slicing the scallion and place it in water to root. I bought one of those kits on Amazon that make it easy to grow the roots. You just put water and the root in a little test tube thingy and leave it there until it roots. Then put it in a pot or outdoors. Scallions are hardy and you can plant them anytime now. If you like scallions and you're growing them outside, maybe let one plant flower and drop its seeds, and then you'll get more plants next spring. Now, mint and lavender are perennials that tend to be invasive, meaning they will grow everywhere the following years. You may want to skip those if you're limited in space and need it for other herbs. The one herb I don't recommend growing are bay leaves. They are used dry, and it is difficult to dry some of these herbs safely. They can grow mold if you're not careful. I use bay leaves quite a bit in soups and broth, but they're not very expensive, and to me it's worth it just to buy the bottle. In general, I wouldn't risk drying the herbs myself without equipment, and you may not have the drying equipment if you're trying to save money. So if you want to invest a little in these starter kits, that might be a good bet, and I'll leave a link to one of them in the show notes. Now, back to the topic of today, which is autoimmune disease, or let's say an overactive inflammatory response. If it seems to you that cases of various inflammatory diseases are on the rise, you would be correct. They have been on the rise for about 50 years, so it's not necessarily linked to the COVID pandemic. They started looking at this in the 80s. From 1988 to 91, they estimated that 22 million Americans were affected by autoimmune diseases. By 2011 to 12, that number jumped to 41 million, and that's just Americans. So it's almost doubled in about 30 years. Many scientists are blaming our Western diet for this rise, citing evidence saying that the highest rates in the countries with the sharpest increases are the United States and England, but some other countries are catching up. The two countries where processed foods are a significant portion of the typical diet are, to no one's surprise, the US and England. This could be more of a complicated issue when trying to look for the specific cause, but I'll be getting into that later today and in the next episode. First, let's define the terms inflammation and autoimmune disease. We all pretty much know what this is. Inflammation is a normal part of our body's defense to either infections or injury. We all know that when we get a cut, the area gets red, swollen, and warm to the touch. That is your natural response to potential pathogenic bacteria or viruses that can enter through the skin. With an injury, inflammation brings a much-needed blood supply to start the healing process. But when inflammation occurs in healthy tissue or remains active, it can create disease. Autoimmune disease happens when the body's natural defense system can't tell the difference between your own cells and foreign cells, causing the body to mistakenly attack normal cells. I read that there are more than 80 types of autoimmune diseases, and it covers a wide range of conditions. The common ones we all know: type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, lupus, and some thyroid conditions such as Graves' disease. We can add inflammatory bowel disease, which includes Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, to this list. Symptoms vary according to the disease, which makes sense. But in general, you feel like you're coming down with something. So you feel fatigue, maybe a low-grade fever, sometimes joint pain and swelling. Skin problems are very common, abdominal pain and or digestive issues, and maybe even swollen glands if the inflammation is in your throat. So it's not your imagination. Inflammatory diseases are getting more common. And you may also have heard that chronic inflammation is now associated with heart disease, asthma, type 2 diabetes, colon cancer, and even depression. Here's a quote from the NIH website on the subject, and I'll put the link in the show notes. Quote, "Increasing evidence suggests environmental factors contribute to chronic inflammation. A review of scientific literature conducted by NIEHS researchers affiliated with the National Toxicology Program found the environment plays a role in inflammation in both positive and negative ways, such as environmental chemicals, nutrition, in particular processed foods that alter gut bacteria, microbiome, social or cultural change, like lack of sleep and stress, childhood obesity, and lack of activity. End quote. I added a few things in that quote to give you some idea what they meant by social change. There's also a few non-food factors, and I'll briefly mention them here, but not get into them. The first is genetics. Certain disorders, such as MS, tend to run in families. That doesn't mean that you'll get it if you have a parent with the disease. It just means that it increases your risk of maybe getting it if lifestyle factors line up. The second thing is weight, which is really related to food. Smoking, enough said about that. So in my opinion, this rise in inflammatory conditions is really mostly about food. But what specifically in the diet is to blame? There is an article in The Guardian that gets into why scientists are blaming autoimmune diseases on the Western diet, and I'll put it in the show notes. I also had a chat with two people recently that were both having symptoms of redness and swelling on their hands and legs that could not be explained away by the typical causes their doctor would rule out. Things like new medications, new detergents, new foods in the diet, cleaning products, travel abroad. Neither person got an answer as to the probable cause for their active immune response. So the medical clinics didn't know. I certainly don't know. But I mentioned to both of them that my gut is telling me that they may have been exposed to something toxic in their environment. I don't know, obviously, but I suspect the source is something in the food they are eating. There's certain things we do know. We do know that 70 to 80% of the food in the supermarket contains a measurable amount of Roundup. And Roundup is a killing agent. Yes, it's designed to kill plants, and plants have a different cell structure than people, but it's a killing agent. Sometimes I tell the story of a neighbor who sprayed dandelion killer on their lawn. An outdoor cat sipped the water from those puddles and died. And as we know, cats are mammals. I don't know what's causing all this. I'm just saying. At this point, I often round up the usual suspects. So at the top of my list, as I've said, we have the active ingredient in Roundup, which is glyphosate. There are also chemical fertilizers like liquid anhydrous ammonia, which will kill earthworms and beneficial soil bacteria, and also pretty lethal pesticides. Here is a related thought, especially thinking about Roundup, ammonia, and pesticides like chlorpyrifos. These agents designed to kill might be wiping out a beneficial gut bacteria or microbiome. And there's some very interesting initial data coming in now about how we can change a gut bacteria into a healthy population of those little buggers and the amazing results of doing so. So I'm going to attack that subject next. But for now, we can make some changes that will definitely lower our risk of getting these autoimmune conditions. Namely, cut down on inflammatory food and increase anti-inflammatory foods. I know, easier said than done. At least, I think it's important to have this information in our back pockets in the event that we get one of these inflammatory conditions. So what's the most inflammatory food in our diets? It turns out that it is meat, and especially processed meats, like bacon, hot dogs, cured meats, and meats that are high in saturated fat, like prime rib. And yes, dairy. I know, say it ain't so. I love my cheese. In addition, processed grains like the sweetened breakfast cereals, cookies, cakes, donuts, etc. Also soda and other sweetened drinks, and fried foods. Now, what are anti-inflammatory foods? Foods with active cultures top the list, such as yogurt and sauerkraut. Foods that are high in soluble fiber, like beans, nuts, and seeds. Also, fresh produce with lots of fiber, such as fruits with skins, deep green or red vegetables, cruciferous vegetables like cabbage, and the thing I'm touting now, which is oatmeal. Now, if you can, with whatever budget you're working with, it might be best to get organic brands of the fruits and vegetables. You can save a little money by getting the frozen organic fruits and blending them with active culture yogurt for the 1-2 punch. I have a few episodes on anti-inflammatory foods, and I'll put them in the show notes. Now, in this article, they mention in addition to eating high fiber foods and low saturated fat foods, it also helps to make some time for exercise, lose a few pounds, doesn't have to be a lot, and adopt some type of stress management technique. I will have more on feeding our gut bacteria in my next episode. Until then, be well and stay tuned for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.